Welcome back, Wargamers, to the verdant forest and putrid filth pits of Giran, as we have a little chat about a major historical event in the mortal realms. Speaking, of course, of the War of Life. Now, we don't have an immense amount of information, but I'll be pulling my info from the Sylvaneth Battle Tome and the core book from the Giran section when they kind of do a review of all the realms. And so let's kick it off by plainly asking the question for newer folks, what was the War of Life? Well, this is the name given to the overall fight for the fate of Giran, realm of life magic, against the forces of chaos largely spearheaded by Nurgle armies. If you wrote a book about the Age of Chaos in general, right, when the primordial chaos gods entered the realms en masse, the War for Life is pretty much what you'd call the chapter on Giran. And right off the bat, I find it really interesting that other realms don't really have the same quite a grandiose name for their attempted defense against chaos. Right? We don't have the War of Flame for Akshi, but for Giran, the battle was so intense that it demanded its own historical spotlight, and we'll certainly get into why. It was different than the other realms. But that's not the only thing that makes Giran a unique or oddity in terms of the coming of chaos. For being one of the most prominent settings in Age of Sigmar lore, we know very little about how chaos got in there. See, when you look at the other stories from the core book, specifically Akshi and Chaman, the two other realms that we had equal coverage of when the game launched, if you were there in the opening days, basically there was 3 campaign settings, those 3, Akshi, Giran, and Chaman. And in those stories, we see grand tales of mortals being swayed by ancient primal gods. There's manipulation, there's treachery, forbidden magics. Seriously, both of those realms have awesome stories about how chaos entered in. I have a video on both, go check them out. But there's scant information that we have regarding how Nurgle specifically entered Giran. But I'll take the scant info we do have, and we're going to paint a picture of this massive event in the mortal realm's history. It begins when the Chaos Gods first caught wind of the mortal realms. Every one of them had their own plans and schemes, but Nurgle specifically had his sight dead set on Giran. Keep in mind, he had armies in other realms, and all the other Chaos Gods also had stuff that entered Giran, but the vast bulk of the Chaos forces that we're going to talk about belonged to Nurgle. So there were Khorne forces there were Nurgle forces in Chaman, and so on. But it's just a matter of where each Chaos God laid their heaviest, armaments. The first alarm of something wrong didn't come with this big stomping of boots from an army, but the soft buzzing of flies. In the deepest jungles of Giran, which, based on the realm's description from the core book, is probably more towards the outer edges, where it's a little bit thicker in terms of fauna and flora and all that stuff, tiny little bloat flies began to poke through reality. Now, we don't have much info here. My conjecture is that their super small size made materialization possible. And these flies weren't the big mounts that the demons and the Rotbringers ride. These were tiny little things, very easy to miss, acting as spies for the God of Plagues. And Nurgle loved what he saw, a realm of dense life ready for corruption. If one organism dying could turn into 1,000, bacteria or maggots or whatever, imagine what he saw when he looked at this densely packed forest with these verdant rivers and so on. But more than the landscape, he also spied on its inhabitants, learning about the various tribes of mortals, their religions, the tension between them, how they communed with nature, each bit of information acting as an arrow in a Chaos God's quiver. Now, we don't exactly know what allowed the first followers of Nurgle into, Giran itself. My guess is that enough of these flies infected a well-hidden part of the forests until the veil between Realm of Chaos and the Garden of Nurgle, his little slice of Realm of Chaos, was weakened. What we do know is that once Nurgle got a foothold, his influence caught like a true wildfire. Consider this. More so than any other realm, a Chaos God was able to hijack the natural environment. Okay? Khorne comes to Akshi, but he has to walk place to place, right? His conquering armies have to go from one territory to the next. And the same goes for Tzeentch in Chaman. But in Giran, Nurgle's power and influence isn't tied to his martial might, or where his physical armies are, because the land is doing most of the work. If you corrupt or pollute a major river, the river itself carries that sickness far beyond the initial pollution site. If you have Nurgle demon fleas, which do exist in the lore, latch on to like a stag or a deer, and it runs away from the Nurgle armies, it takes corruption with it as it runs away. The nature of how Nurgle influences the environment and how he spreads, like through disease and corruption, all that stuff, is fundamentally different from that of his brothers, and it is perfectly tailored to destroy this realm. Now, at this point, Allarielle senses something is wrong, right? She and her realm are one, but it's a big place. So that seed that Nurgle came through must have been very, very tiny. It wasn't noticeable at all. But once things kind of catch on, she acts very swiftly. She calls all available Sylvaneth groves back home, as well as any mortal allies living in Giran, elves that would one day be known as the Wanderers. You got humans, even Duarden live there. But this only reveals how deeply the corruption has already gone, because by now Nurgle has corrupted mortals of his own, and the mighty plague legions of demons are being supported by the newly christened Rotbringers. And this is where all that spying came into devastating effect. By learning all about the various people groups across the realm, Nurgle was able to manipulate them into falling into his hands. For example, one that's given in the core book is that tribes that worshipped, the rain god, which I'm sure was very innocent and very nice back in the day, were blessed by Rodagus, who he's kind of like the rain father, and he brings fertile showers and he drenches them in corruption. People who lived near swamps were consumed body and soul. People begging for reprieve of the afflictions of Nurgle were graciously granted as much in exchange for a lifetime of service, of course. And with this, the lines were drawn. Hundreds of battlefronts were fought all at once. Pollution and corruption meeting purification and cleansing. All of Giran was set ablaze with war. As in the human body, where white blood cells are dispatched to fight an infectious virus that's entered the system, so too were the forces of order trying their best to push back the armies of the plague god. But in a war of attrition, Nurgle is a tough god to beat. Every realm gate that's seized by the forces of Nurgle meant less Sylvaneth reinforcements coming in from somewhere else to help, and also more demonic hosts from the gateway of Nurgle coming in as well, so it's like a total flip-flop. And remember, Sylvaneth are all over in every mortal realm, but by the time this is all going on, every realm is under siege in some capacity. So it's not like anyone's just chillin', there aren't a whole lot of reinforcements to go anywhere. And while there was a back and forth between Nurgle and Allarielle's armies for some time, the plague god was relentless, and great at grinding his enemies down both physically with these constant assaults from his armies and emotionally by spreading a sense of hopelessness and despair. Many mortals gave themselves up willingly to Nurgle, whether they needed relief from the many diseases he had poisoned the land with, or they were specifically like one character named Torglug, who was a Chaos champion, who was tortured into service. It was not a willing thing. For many elven clans, they looked at the ever-blighted lands and sought hope elsewhere. They left the goddess of life at her greatest hour of need, being labeled as wanderers. They made their way to Azir. And here we see what I think is the greatest weakness of our forces of order, right? The realm is tied to Allarielle, like I said earlier. And as darkness grew and consumed Giran, its allies fleeing or turning upon one another, so too did a darkness begin to stir within the goddess of life. Her children were scattered across the realms, meaning the Sylvaneth. She had left the pantheon of gods to see the defense of her own realm all alone. There was no allies to turn to. And so she too fell into a deep despair. The same hopelessness that saturates her kingdom grew inside her as well. So, taking the last bit of defense that she had, she retreated to a well-hidden pocket realm known as Athelweird and sat defeated, essentially grieving the second world and family that she had lost, since Allarielle's a character that came over from the old world. And honestly, she stayed that way for what is likely several decades at the minimum, centuries at the high end. We don't have a great timetable for the War of Life, but we know it's often described that Nurgle swept through the fastest, so this might have all happened, earlier or at least faster than chaos forces sweeping through other realms. And things stayed just like that until a very unnatural storm began to brew in the skies. And that's a different story because That's the story of the Age of Sigmar and the coming of the Stormcast Eternals. But the War of Life was, for all intents and purposes, lost. Now I want to make a quick note here. There is one line in a book that says like the War of Life began again when Allarielle took on her new war aspect, but the truth is in the core book it really describes that section of like, you know, the part 2 that we're currently in where Allarielle's back in action, she's not sulking in depression anymore, typically called the Seasons of War instead of the War of Life. But regardless, let's talk about why this story is cool. There's so many freaking reasons, okay? Nurgle's ability to hijack his prey, I do feel like is unique amongst the other Chaos Gods. With the exception of maybe Slaanesh, who specifically when it comes to society and us wanting to achieve more and be better at things can hijack our own pride and arrogance and kind of turn good intentions to darkness. But I mean, in terms of just raw, natural ability to command, what his environment, Nurgle wins. And I also like this story because spying and manipulation is a side we don't really see often in Nurgle. Usually it's very upfront. His armies just kind of walk up and they're like, hey, join us. No? Okay, whatever. That kind of stuff. But we don't see spying and the slow churn and insidious kind of nature of chaos with him too often. And I wish we saw it more, to be honest with you. One thing that stands out to me is that even though we don't have like a good picture of like how the War of Life went down from a campaign perspective, we actually do have a lot of really cool epic stories that happen in that time, right? When we've seen snippets from things like the story of Torglug, who was a Chaos Champion who then later became Tornus the Redeemed, Stormcast Eternal. We also have things like the story of Black Talon, which is a book that we explored here on the channel. Her backstory as a mortal heavily involves the War of Life. It's just interesting things like that. So it seems like it's been a fantastic setting for some of these events that have to do a lot with the internal conflicts of Stormcast Eternals and like understanding what this corruption of the land did to them. But unfortunately, we just don't get a lot of that in, like, say, campaign material, which is a shame because this story, the coming of Nurgle and how he interacts with Giran as a realm, it just matches a body fighting an infection. It's just so perfect, and I absolutely love it. And so I'll go ahead and ask this and leave it here. What do you like about the War of Life, right? What stories would you like to see told? Even kind of ancillary things would be really nice, like, say, a Grove of Sylvaneth trying to make it there to help Allarielle, but they find that the realm gate is closed because Nurgle claimed it right before they arrived. Things like that would have happened given the scale of this story. It's just a thing that we haven't really explored or seen. So anyway, friends, let me know your thoughts. I'd love to hear your feedback. Let me know in the comments down below. Thank you for watching and listening, and I'll catch you in my next Age of Sigmar lore story. Have a wonderful day and happy wargaming. Hey everybody, I hope you enjoyed that video. It was made possible by the folks over here to the left. These are my top supporters over here on YouTube and on Patreon that keep this channel going. If you'd like to learn more about how to become a supporter and get some cool things in the process, like exclusive pictures and interactions with me and get your questions answered here on the channel, go ahead and click any of the links down below or the join button on the community page over on YouTube. Regardless of your choice, I wanted to thank you so much for joining me with this video, and I look forward to seeing you in my next one. Happy wargaming.